concepts. I know there's some folks in the room that were here for the training academy we did a few months ago. I think we tried to snag the mayor running through, but you were like, no, got to get somewhere, so that's all good. I think over the last decade or so, this is the third or fourth project we've had the opportunity to do here, looking at things like safe routes to school and an effort called an activity connection plan. And a little bit of a background is the city got the funding and stuff for the overall transportation master plan. Because of the work we do through the Department of Health and Welfare, they were able to bolster the active transportation component with additional funds beyond what the city had. That allows us to take a little bit deeper dive than the budget for those plans normally allow. So in lots of times, and if you go back to even your 2009 or so transportation master plan, maybe a map of pathways and things, but not taking a deeper dive into policies and integrating that. So I know Ardura is the lead consulting firm for the transportation master plan. We've been with the status meetings with them. And some of the stuff we'll show you today, especially as we get toward the back of this with the maps, we're still fine-tuning based on their findings coming in. And the goal of this is this will definitely be a chapter of the transportation master plan that you'll have eventually coming before you, and certainly with more detailed things in the appendix in there. So that's a little bit of the background on this. In terms of active transportation and what is it, it's what we walking, rolling, or bicycling, and rolling meaning, you know, folks from other types of mobility like scooters or people with disabilities, and looking at how they do that for transportation purposes, just going somewhere, whether it's a school, a park, a grocery store, a senior center. And the big thing that probably differs in that realm is the senses that we experience that through. That's just much more right there for us than we kind of have. Our automobiles take away a lot of our senses in that regard. We even now have noise canceling cabins in our vehicles and things like that. And really for our community, when we think of statistics, that roughly about 1 in 3 are at an age where either too young to drive or reaching an age where driving is becoming more difficult. It's their freedom to move about their community, especially while they're here in Mountain Home. And we've tried to take that through that lens and looking at this. So a little bit of just Mountain Home by the numbers. You guys are close to 16,000, probably looking at some notable numbers growing there. We know we've seen the growth before, and because of the dynamics, especially with the base and other things, you know, 1 in 4 of your population is age 18 or younger. Weirdly enough, 1 in 8 is over the age of 65, and that's certainly a little bit of a different number than we see in a lot of places. We start seeing more of an aging population in there. 1 in 5 have a disability in the city, and another interesting statistic is more than 50% of those that do are actually in what we would call the working age, 18 to 64. And again, we'll oftentimes see this number reflective more in the older adult population, and I'm guessing whether that's from veteran status or other things related to the military have that. But if we know that 1 out of 5 has a disability, we know that their ability to get around, cross the street, and do some of those things are limiting. Our work and efforts try to integrate things about health and improving that part of the community. And the data for the city show, you know, 1 in 3 report being obese, with about 15% just reporting overall fair or poor health. And this has given folks those abilities to do that. One of the things that happens in this, if you look at just like census numbers, one of the limitations is the only transportation figures in there is people's journey to work. And in much of Idaho, and you're no exception, people's journey to work, it takes them beyond the city limits, whether they're commuting to a place like Boise, which we see a significant number, and certainly the Treasure Valley. And so when we talk about the walking and biking piece, we know there's a limiting factor in terms of the commutes just because of that. And instead look at it through the lens of when people get back here to their community, how can they access the destinations and places they want to be if they've had to go through an hour or so commute. And the map shows the data in terms of what those commute flows are, or it did. I don't know why it disappeared. Come back, maybe. I don't know. Never had that happen.
It could be our HDMI cable. Just saying.
There we go. So what you see in the circular number is of the people that live in Mountain Home and are employed, 1,800 are able to live and work in the city, but 4,000 every day leave the city limits to go elsewhere, Air Force Base, other parts, and 2,200 live outside the city and come to the city to work. So that's some of the dynamics that we're working with. I'm going to turn it over to Chris to talk a little bit of just kind of the bigger picture of things and why some of this is important, and talking about the reasons why people and the studies show are willing to walk and what they're willing to walk for. And I don't know what the gremlins are in the system here, but
well, while we're waiting for that to get rebooted, just a quick thank you, because my company, Vitruvian Planning, was born here in Mountain Home in I think it was 11. I got to get my own date right. Our very first project was here in Mountain Home, and we worked with East Elementary and the students there at Hacker Middle School, and had a really amazing time, and just always good to be back here in the city. So appreciate your time and efforts. So the question, as he gets this booted back up, maybe, is when we think about walking, we think about our reasons for walking. Ask yourself that question. Why do you purposely go and walk, or even take a bike, right? A lot of times it might be, hey, I got a dog, right? That might be number one reason. Or I want to just kind of let my head just kind of go and let my brain detach for a minute. I got stress going on. Or I'm walking with my kids or grandkids, to school or to a park. That's kind of what this graphic sums up. What are the top reasons why we are motivated to walk? And our biggest reason is for recreation, whether it's going up on your great pathway up by the highway, right, or other places that are similar in recreation. And school and church and those types of things are then second. How do we get to the next level? How do we get to walking to go have dinner or have something for breakfast? Or if we work in town, maybe we're close enough, maybe it's that, right? And start to think about those things, because a lot of times our vehicle trips are sometimes not necessarily critical for the distance. And so your American Legion Boulevard, for example, might be seeing people who are taking a car who might live even across the street, and that's gumming up your highway and on local Main Street in a way, and a missed opportunity just to get physically active and move around and so forth. So when we think about that, we think about the infrastructure getting to and from, we think about the approximate distance to and from. So just kind of lending ourselves to how do we take this information and move the needle in this direction. A little bit of background. In this instance, our state, we're seeing trends that are similar to the national level. This year in particular, 2023, we won't have that data because of the delay in the reporting and working through, police records and stuff for probably another year and a half. But this year in particular, it is really bad. We're seeing a lot of serious crashes and fatalities amongst folks who are walking and or biking. But even a couple of years ago, still in the midst of coming out of COVID and all of that sort of stuff, every 3 days, someone in a very rural state is still being struck and either seriously injured or killed. And that trend nationally is definitely going the wrong direction. You can just see for yourself, 50%, 57% death increase. That's going to be even more significant as we go into this year because of what we're seeing. There's a lot of reasons behind it. And I kind of just sort of highlighted on this, but this was 2021, almost 7,500. This number, I wouldn't be surprised if in 2023 we eclipse nationally 9,000 people. That's definitely the wrong direction. And in context, you can see, at least on the bar chart, can't read it, but go back to 2009, that number was 4,100. 4,100 in 2009, trending toward 8,000 and above in 2023 with respect to pedestrian fatalities. So definitely an issue. If the emotional argument doesn't always resonate, you're a facts person, you're a dollar person, fine. Then going back to our last year, statewide financial total for fatalities, fatal crashes and serious crashes, we're looking on the magnitude of nearly
The
$400 million
original argument doesn't always say.
overall. Was that me? That's reverberation there. Sorry. Anyway, just making sure. So about 400 million all told is what's happening. We all have a price tag, so to speak, on our heads that's assigned by insurance companies, and that's how that number was tallied. And you can see for yourself some of the other subsections of where that's coming from. So this is you. This is specific data, the last batch of data that we have for Mountain Home. This was provided by the local Highway Technical Assistance Council, LTAC. You can go on the website and find this for yourself. Just type in LHTAC, then GIS and safety, and you'll be able to manipulate this map all over the state of Idaho, including for Mountain Home. But there are some pretty interesting things that we see. You can kind of just visually look and see for yourself, you know, where do we see hotspots, right? Out of the 472 all-in crashes, this is not just a bike ped crash, but all in. 22 were severe, 1 fatal, and we definitely see some patterns, and we'll look at that now specific to bike and ped. This was something we crunched just a couple days ago, and it was pretty compelling to me. So 27 total crashes in the last 5 years involving someone who walked and/or bikes, right? 8 of which severe, 1 fatal. So that kind of gives you a sense of that disabling amount. But this is really fascinating to me. Out of the 27, 18 were on the state system. That's pretty significant. 18 out of the 27, either severe and fatal and all that, was on that system. So it tells you a lot. It tells you that this is a place where people want to walk because of the land uses. It tells you of the safety issues of crossing and so on. It says a lot, you know, but when we think about that, then the question is, okay, what do we do with that? So I want to breeze through these 4 C's components, and want you to hopefully plant a few seeds about some of this stuff. When we think about roadway design, and I want you to start thinking about comfort first, we think a lot about our vehicles. We think about our vehicle speed. We think about if 4 or 5% of all traffic is comprised of freight, it totally changes the geometry that we apply to the streets and the curves and so forth. We think about our headlights. We think about our vehicle height. When's the last time you tried to think about putting a banner celebrating whatever, name your festival, over the highway, and what were you told, right? Probably no, probably, right? Could be 50 feet up and you're still told no because we're considering that and that maybe one large vehicle that comes through. But I want you to think about this other part of it. Your comfort, your height, your sight, your width, your walking speed, all of the things that go into making you, and we look at all of the people of Mountain Home, our differences amongst one another. So when we think about and kind of put this all together, we need to think about, at least in some respects, our width. So I think about, we put people in hula hoops as a demonstration tool. Shaking your head. I don't remember who we put in hula hoops while we were here. Who was it? Do you guys remember? We always try to put the mayor in, so you're lucky you missed out on that one. But we do it for a reason, because when I ask your personal space, right, I say, how much space do you feel like you need in order to just be comfortable next to the person next to you, right, or person next to you? Almost to a T, it's about right here. It's about this. This is the bubble. That hula hoop represents the bubble space. When we think about our sidewalk space in a residential context, in our downtown, we think of multiple people or different scenarios, someone who's jogging, right, versus walking, someone in a wheelchair. All these different dimensional needs are important. And the last thing on this is also thinking about this vertical barrier. I want you to think about your code. That's part of why we wanted to have this joint meeting. Thinking about your own code. If someone would have put a fence on their property line, right on the edge, next to the public right-of-way and i.e. the sidewalk, what does that mean? Well, it means this. What it means is that our functional width of that walk space could be 5 feet on a concrete surface. We don't walk right up next to it, right? We give ourselves space. That's why in our code we often back that fence off by 6 inches or maybe even a foot, trying to make sure that we optimize our sidewalk space. Other comfort things, speed. Speed is a massive factor. It is absolutely an incredibly important factor. So when you see a person like this, these children who are walking all the way off to the side, what are they doing? Are they unintelligent human beings and they're walking nearly in the ditch? They're trying to protect themselves because they physically feel and kind of sense that speed, the motorists coming towards them, and are trying to avoid being a statistic, which we're pointing out with this. If it's 20 miles an hour versus 40 and you're struck, there's an inverse relationship between survivability, right? It makes sense. And so you get a slower speed, it's efficient in some ways, and we're hopefully trying to avoid the being the statistic we talked about earlier. Context, the next of the 4 C's, so number 2. Context is really important in the sense of not one size fits all. Again, if I look at your code, and we did this as part of your plan, so that's going to be in the report. I think we've already included that in a working paper. How do we differentiate our commercial zone, our industrial zone, our residential zones, right, in terms of our application of a walkability type of principle? And they definitely ought to change because the environments change. So if we just apply a one-size-fits-all 5 foot right here, that facility is not really going to be used by very much, right? Where it's not optimized as an investment. So the tax dollars that you're using to put that infrastructure in may be limited in its return on its investment. So context is a big piece of that. Just a few other images here. I think this is you, right?
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, amazing, right? But look at what all is in this image. Space, wide enough for multiple people to be side by side and another person potentially to come against them. We should expect that given all of the activity here. The land use and the doors opening in and out. This buffer space between us and the moving vehicles gives you that sense of comfort. So many things done really, really well, right? But that all has to be codified in order for it to be applied and lawful. Connections. Oh man. There's so many times when we miss the mark, right? So many times when we look at a project like this and just go, how did this happen? Oh, well, that was a separate project on the capital improvement plan. The intersection versus, wait a minute, really? Because when we're walking, do we care? But this detail matters, right? And we see this all the time.
That's Rich's fault.
Brand new curb ramp. We have a brand new curb ramp. Well, wait a minute. How am I supposed to get there? You know, and so often those details matter. The connections also come from A to B. Oftentimes we think, you know, and maybe even some folks who, when they saw this course being offered, well, what, just put sidewalks in and call it good. All right, but there's way more to it. And I promise you that sidewalks is not the only treatment. We were just in Preston and Montpelier, and this morning and yesterday, they don't have the money for curb gutter sidewalk. You probably don't have the money for curb and gutter sidewalk everywhere. We have it in phases and batches, and we have to be patient. But what about in the interim? There are so many other ways to allow us to get from A to B and provide some basic types of infrastructure before we even have to get to curb gutter sidewalk. And so that's part of the things that we've talked about and are going to be in the plan that we provide to you. So those connections really are important. And here's just other examples of some of those, whether it's temporary paint. Hey man, we don't have the money. Let's try to do something, right? An extruded curbing treatment. This is one of my favorite treatments because we have asphalt out there. All right, let's use a little bit of it. Our vehicles aren't. Okay, so put some extruded curbing in there. Let it drain. I don't have to worry about any of the rain sheeting off of it. It's all going to be handled that way, and I instantly create a walk space. It's temporary until we get to the curb gutter sidewalk, but it's still functional, right? Other ways, even getting to the front door of a major retailer or even a minor retailer, but not having to worry about dodging, vehicles coming in and out of the parking area and other pieces. You get that. Last thing for me in terms of crossing, or the C's, is crossings. In our state and really across the country, give or take about 65% of folks who are struck and injured, killed, what have you, involves this. Just trying to cross the street, man. I'm just trying to get from A to B. One thing that drives me nuts is going around this country and seeing bus infrastructure. We have a bus stop. And if we don't have a crosswalk to get near, then that is a wasted opportunity and wasted investment, frankly. And we ask the question, well, no one's riding the bus. Well, if I can't get back and forth to it, then it's there's your answer. That's at least in part, right? But this crossing is so important, and we spend a lot of time on it in coming up and describing various ways to help get across the street. When we go out on the walk, we'll illustrate some of that. So whether it's curb extensions that bring that closer together, the whole point is just keeping me out of harm's way. It's limiting the amount of time I'm exposed to essentially a moving vehicle that could hurt me, right? Same thing with the refuge island. This is a state highway. It's in Filer. ITD tells you they can't do it. Oh, yeah, they can. We've seen this all over the place, and it can be done. So there's lots of different things. These are just some of the keys. Minimizing crossings, the distance between crossings. That's another question. Ask yourself this all the time. If you're in your city or another city, and you're there and you want to cross the street, and you look around, right? Where's the nearest crosswalk? Mark crosswalk. Oh, it's clear over there. What's our impulse? Right? We constantly call that jaywalking. Technically, by legal definition, is definitely not jaywalking. But you just reinforce the point that if we don't put these at frequent intervals, then we're basically creating a difficult situation. Last thing on this is I want to point out is right here, all times of day. About 75% of folks who are struck and hurt or killed, it happens in dark hours. What is going to happen in about a month and a half from now, maybe 2 months from now? Our daylight savings time ends, sun goes down about 4, school's in session, it's dark at the beginning of school, pretty dark at the end of school, right? And yet, when do we ever actually go out in the evening or at night and audit our walking conditions for lighting, right? So that's something that's, do it in your own neighborhood, back of the envelope, write some things down. You all are the doers of the city, right? So there's a way to improve conditions, but you kind of get the point. And I don't need to hit on this. This is just technical information that backs up what I just said. Essentially 600 feet is the maximum distance between crossings, but another day we'll hit that one.
Well, and I think just back to this, we'll see it in the crossing map, and especially if you go back to the crash map that Chris showed, or the challenges are on the ITD roads. This is guidance from a national organization called AASHTO, the American Association of State and Highway Transportation Officials. ITD sits on their board of directors and technical committees, and here's where they say kind of where spacing is between signalized intersections exceeds 600 feet. We need to give pedestrians a crossing to get across there, and that's kind of from a rigid perspective. I think as you kind of get onto your streets and things, you see there's adjustments to be made, but the federal guidance is enough for that. So Chris covered a lot on the walking side of things, and really that's kind of the fundamental thing. It's something that we as a species are designed to do and have been doing for a long time, and the mode that most people take part in. On the bicycling side, this is probably one of the fastest changing in terms of science and what we know. And what this chart from the Federal Highway Administration simply says, you've probably all heard, oh man, we kind of just went out and striped that bike lane and we hardly see anybody using it. Yep, that's pretty predictable. And here where we show the type of facilities and the type of riders, that more confident rider, that person that all of us kind of look at and say, man, what are they doing out there? Do they have a death wish? Why would I do that? We call them mammals, middle-aged males in Lycra out there. And they're confident and they're comfortable doing those things. But I've certainly been in that situation, but with children and getting older, I'm no longer in that situation. I want something different. And what the science is now telling us is really, in the same way we separate a sidewalk from moving traffic, thinking about bicycle facilities, especially on higher speed routes, is really what people are more accustomed to. So if we start to make this investment, we start to appeal to the broader sense of the population, and we start to think about what I talked about with trip making and people willing to get places by bike with their family to get to the park. And what you really have the best example of that is the pathway system that you had. This is a matrix of speed, vehicle speed, and vehicle volumes from the Federal Highway Administration. And it really shows that once we start to tip 30 miles an hour and more than 6,000 vehicles a day, that's when we need to start talking about that separation. So certainly any of your arterials and busier streets are the type where we need to think about that. And we just charted some of the city streets on here that are your main ones just to show where they fall on that. And I'll get to that in a second, especially with the ITD route. So that's kind of a quick run through the ideas and concepts. As Chris said, especially on the planning board side, several different recommendations to consider as you move forward with other code updates to fine-tune these things, especially as we knowing you're getting more growth, you have a new impact fee program, you're kind of starting to think about those things differently. And while it may seem like an uphill battle within your current footprint, if you're 16,000 today, but maybe you're 30,000 in another 20 years, and everything with the additional 14,000 people you add can be made better through thinking this way, you've made a significant progress on that front. By comparison, if you think of a city like Lewiston, Lewiston hasn't grown in population in 50 years and hasn't had the opportunities to retrofit and deal with an older system. So while we have certain growing pains that happen with growth, it also provides us more opportunities to kind of get these things, I won't say right to imply that what's done today is wrong. We're just in a new era and a new way of thinking about some of these things. So when we get into facility recommendations and what's in there, things like, as going back to Chris's on the one size fits all, if we can get a buffer between the street and the sidewalk, even in residential settings, that's what we want to try to do. Are there going to be exceptions? Certainly, but one of the simple things we see in code is in subdivisions where we allow rolled curbing. Anybody want to remember why developers really like rolled curbing versus the vertical curbing?
Cheaper.
Cheaper? Why is it cheaper?
Because it doesn't take a machine to do it.
Doesn't take a machine. They lay out the streets and sidewalks first, right? Then the lots are sold and the houses are developed. So if we had to recut a driveway every time, we would have that. The rolled curbing allows the driveway to go everywhere. That's sensible. But if we don't have a buffer, we then create an enforcement and an ADA issue because everybody says, oh, I'll be nice and get out of the road and park my truck out there, or I'll level my camper trailer or get my boat up there. You've probably all seen it. So ideally, if we're going to allow that, which is understandable, getting a buffer helps us avoid those kind of things. As Chris said, adjusting sidewalk width requirements in the code by land use. Do we need sidewalks and a big pathway on both sides of an industrial street? Probably not. Let's reserve that for the areas that may be more conducive to those kind of things and be sensitive to how those different land uses do occur. So when we get into specifics, this is what you're going to see. I'm going to move you through some different facility types that are mostly combined for active transportation and the types of routes they would go on. Getting back to the effort in terms of buffered and for bicycling and walking, what's called a side path is really becoming the preferred treatment, especially at the ITD level for roadways. No longer the in-street bike lanes. This is the pathway built on Chinden Boulevard in Meridian. So you can kind of go see an example. Now they had a lot of right-of-way there, right? So you see this really big drainage swale, really big buffer. If you think about a retrofit of any of your ITD roads, you're probably not going to be able to have that much space, so we have to think a little bit different. This is the Highway 55 concept going out through Nampa. You can see 170 feet of right-of-way, but it's also a thing, if ITD comes in and wants to do corridor plans and look at things in your city, we want to give you the foundation in your plan to go, well, our plan says this, let's start the discussion there. We might need to adjust for right-of-way. We may need to consider we only do this on one side of the street, but it gives you the foundation to start that conversation. And oftentimes when they go through those things, they will look at your city plans to kind of start that discussion. And certainly you guys, I think, with the downtown project have a really good rapport. I think they showed some flexibility in other things that we definitely use as examples in other parts of the state when they have the same efforts for that. So a side path, it's really about thinking about taking the success of your pathway system and putting it along streets to connect the same destinations. I shouldn't want to get in my car to drive to the trailhead to use the pathway if I can have a facility that can get me there. And things like Air Base, American Legion, that's where the speed is, that's where the risk is, that's where we need to look at separating people. In general, they're 10 feet in width with a 5-foot buffer, but you can go narrower and put in vertical elements if you have constraints. We will outline some of those design conventions in the plan. So if we look at where these might be, there's 3 different line types in here, and sorry for those online who did not see close enough. The solid line is your existing pathway that you have. There's another segment down here. I kind of zoomed in closer, and we're still fine-tuning some stuff in this area. The smaller dotted lines are the proposed pathways from your older 2009 transportation plan. And what you see as the dashed lines that are kind of highlighted are the other recommended connections where those side paths would occur. And that's primarily along the ITD routes. It's primarily running north-south over here. And then where I put these dots is about conversations that should occur over the years. 1, a rebuild of the interchange and a concept for there. 2, I'm sorry, this one should be over here. I misplaced it. Your growth plan doesn't show you going north of the freeway where the other 2 overpasses exist. But if there's a time that ITD comes in and says, hey, we're rebuilding these overpasses because of age, we've got one chance to get those right. And setting it up to where either they have maybe a side path on one side or are designed, like there's a couple in Canyon County, that can easily be added to, and they account for the additional weight for that. Those are the kind of aspirational things to think of. The connection between your downtown, the railroad underpass, and that, I think is always going to be a challenge from any mode of transportation, and who knows what the future looks like for that. But as you grow over here and as these plans are realized, this area and figuring out solutions to get people across the tracks in all different forms should be accounted for. So it's kind of purposely left undefined because we didn't want to propose something of, oh, hey, that's great, but that's going to cost $50 million, because we know that that's not going to be realistic. So that's what we would consider kind of the off-street pathway system that starts to link things together. Working our way down is a combination of things, and one is kind of a more traditional approach of sidewalks plus bike lanes, but these are generally reserved for streets that are going to have much lower operating speeds and lower vehicle volume, so people would be more comfortable doing that, and it's still necessary to manage some of those speeds. So whether we have what's called a buffered bike lane and maybe we can't get a buffered sidewalk, or we can get a bike lane and a buffered sidewalk, that's a combination. And if you think about, especially over here on the north side of town, a lot of those north-south local routes that connect, those are the types of situations we'd be looking for that. Also, given the thing about some consternation and also some street constraints about bike lanes, if we can do other things to traffic calm the street, not only does it make it more conducive for that, it makes it safer for the drivers as well. And there's a series of applications that could be had in there that we would call a combined sidewalk and what we would call a bike boulevard, which is just a way to say we've put in some traffic calming and other treatments where sharing the lane is a possibility. In this example, it serves a dual purpose. If you can see the speed hump there, one of the things we'll hear from the fire department is concerns over speed humps slowing them down. Well, there's a gap here and a gap here set at the axle width of a fire truck that most of our vehicles can't get through. So it doesn't slow them down, and it also provides a slot for people on bikes to get through. Over in Ada County, they do this as a pretty frequent treatment. So if you want to go see some over there to see what they look like, that's a way to balance those different needs and interests. And so when we look at the street system and we look at the blue dashed lines, these are the places we feel there's potential to apply some sort of these treatments. And we're probably not going to get too deep in prescribing them, because maybe putting in a bike lane and doing that stuff means removing parking from one side of the street. And we know that's never an easy conversation to have. I think a goal for many of these would be to at least try to get some form of a sidewalk gap filled where you have these routes. So we're providing that basic level of connectivity. And as you work through other projects, as you pursue grants, you can define some of them. But you start to see then the connected system of slower speed streets where maybe we're a little more comfortable sharing that. We can get to the higher speed streets. That's where we have the separated pathway. And then when we start to look at your land uses, the P is a park, the S is a school, the G is a grocery store. And one of our goals was to connect those types of destinations. And so I want to ask you, where is your grocery store west of the tracks? You don't have one, right? But with the growth and things that are coming, it wouldn't surprise me the next several years you start to see an application or something there. And hopefully with the system that we've integrated into that, it can be made so if we... Is it a touch screen there?
It is.
It is a touchscreen.
Is it?
Yeah.
Maybe that's the secret on there. I don't know.
I deliberately have backed away and not moved.
Not touch. I believe you. All right. Maybe the last time. We're almost done with this. And then finally, the crossings. As Chris said, this is probably the most critical piece. And I would say as a short-term endeavor, working with ITD especially to package some of these. And you've done some of them already, and we're going to talk about a couple different types. This one is one you're probably familiar with, a rectangular rapid flash beacon. They're just the dual flashing yellow lights. They're LEDs. They're set at the same frequency as emergency vehicles. And believe it or not, over the years, we've become programmed to respond and react to that, which is why they have a pretty good yield compliance. They can also be done for trail settings and a combined side, and there's some other design nuances for that. The issue that we see on these is they're really meant for streets that are 3 lanes or less and 30 miles an hour or less. And this again is where kind of the science and understanding of these is changing because they're a relatively new application. And so here's an example with your pathway crossing on 18th. Is that right? This is the type of setting, a 2-lane street, pretty good visibility, maybe a potential upgrade to that yellow flashing light could be in the cards at a situation like that, especially if people are coming across that overpass and from the sight distance standpoint.
On the right-hand side, and I'll tell you a story firsthand. When we noticed I want to point out a detail here. What side of the pathway, as you're facing the street, is the signpost? Right here. So if I'm facing this way,
Yeah.
what side of the path is the signpost? It's on the left-hand side, right? So if I want to cross over, that signpost is over here. The city of Ketchum, right, had us come out and take a look at one almost exactly like this. They had the flashing beacon. I think it was even more robust than that. And they're like, people aren't using it. We can't figure out why. 90% of you in this room are what-handed.
Right.
When you have a bicycle and you have one free hand, where are you looking to use it, right? Guess what side of the trail their button was located? On the left-hand side. So because it was on the left-hand side and it's a trail, people were kind of feeling like, well, do I have to go on the other side as people were coming against me and it's my left? There was no natural movement or inclination to go this way. So no one was pushing the button. And so it was as simple as that. Moving it to the other side and miracles happen. It's so silly, right? But yet there was a reality.
And if you look closely at this one, that's exactly what they did. On this side, a joint pole with a signal or with a button, that's obviously the cheapest, but over here there's a separate button that is on the right side. That's kind of the devil's in the details of some of those things. And then when we look at stuff like this is where I said the science and understanding is changing. We're starting to realize, and it's why that recommendation of these on a wider street is challenging and may not have the same results because where you put these out, they're so far out of our peripheral vision as drivers. it's where we need to think about something a little bit of higher level. So our recommendation would be to try to work with ITD and move in a different direction on some of these, especially where you've got school crossings. And that's with what's called the pedestrian hybrid beacon. And these are ones where a driver is stopped, and if you've experienced these, the solid red means stop, and that corresponds to when a pedestrian has the walk signal. The moment the countdown starts, this starts what's called a wigwag. So when you pull up to a railroad crossing and you see the alternating red, it changes to that, which means a driver may come to a complete stop and then proceed if it's clear. And the reason these tend to find a good balance is if we put a full traffic signal out there, and those of us that can walk faster can get across there in 10 seconds, but we have to give 30 seconds, that doesn't make the drivers happy. This finds that particular happy medium. And this one is one actually on an ITD route that we found out in Montpelier with the school zone. So kind of a precedent for those. And this is where we're talking about 4 lanes and wider for that. And the good thing with both of these, there's not a hard and fast number of pedestrians that have to be crossing to justify them. The reason that's the case is these are meant to be more flexible and meant to be applied without the same rigid standards that apply to regular traffic signals. And you've probably all been in that discussion with ITD. Can we get a traffic signal there? Well, no, it doesn't meet warrants because of factors X, Y, Z, Q, and P. They can be a lot more flexible with these to upgrade for those. And so when we look at the crossings, the red dots with the yellow are ones to consider in the future, some type of upgrade. If they already have traffic signals, say on American Legion, and we're coming through, maybe we do things like a push button for the bicyclists on the side of the curb, or if we're looking at a pathway, that changes the geometry and maybe upgrading some of those. We put these two in as crossings issues that might be related to the railroad tracks or the highway, and that's a whole other different dynamic, a whole other thing. Typically getting, because the railroad tracks built on a berm, a tunnel underneath is much more conducive, but you know how working with railroads can be on that front. Some of those things we definitely see as a little more aspirational on that front. So next steps, we're going to be wrapped up with this part of it by the end of September. That's both the city deadline and for the Idaho Health and Welfare grant. Like I said, we're at this stage and ready to put pen to paper on the detailed plan sections related to the facilities. We sent your staff a working paper on kind of some data and some of the policy work and other things. So you'll be seeing that as you see those iterations of the plan that comes out and integrating that with the Ardura effort. And then it's about implementation and going forth with that. Chris and I, with the work we do across the state, we're always a phone call away on this stuff. I know Rich and others have even done that from time to time. Always happy to answer those questions. Making this sausage is not always the prettiest process, and this is just one element of a bigger transportation plan that we're considering. So what we want to do for the last bit is go out and take a walk and kind of see some of these in the field and what we're talking about. But I know with the 2 folks that are online, and certainly any kind of here in the room questions, we'll be happy to answer those if you have them.
Mayor?
Councilman Brennan?
Yeah, it's a question. I know it's kind of hard for me to follow exactly, but you've spent a lot of time on bicycle and pedestrian information. Where's the information based on just the recommendations of our street structure and intersections that need immediate improvements?
Yeah, that's going to be coming more for the Ardura analysis that they're working on with the traffic modeling and stuff. And so the roadway pieces that we talked about with the walking and bicycling infrastructure will be then combined with what they ultimately recommend for things like intersection improvements, roadway widenings, and things like that.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Mayor,
Councilman McGarvey?
I just want to thank you guys. I'm sorry I was not there in person, but it was easy to follow along. You guys did a great presentation, and I walk and bike, and it is kind of treacherous, and I have little ones that try to cross those intersections, and it's kind of scary. So I appreciate you guys' information and work on this for our community.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah. Thank you.
Council, anything?
No, thank you though. Great job.
Good job, guys.
Okay.
Is it open for one question?
We have, yeah, go ahead. I think it says there's some, yeah, go ahead.
To this gentleman here? Sure. To my knowledge, there are not any handicap parking along the Mountain Home development downtown.
Hmm.
You guys have an answer for that in your future studies?
So that's a whole other animal, and ADA, you might be better at answer.
Yeah.
Don does ADA projects all day, every day. It's certainly, part of code, should be part of code, and implementing, a particular number of stalls. It's usually a ratio of number of stalls, for those dedicated and not. It applies to public and private right away. So if that's a missing element, it's something that needs to be addressed. You want to go from there?
In general, and I'm going off of a bad memory of the way downtown, and it's an odd subtlety. If the parking stalls are painted and marked and individually striped, that means the requirement is to provide one accessible stall for about every 28 or 29 of total stalls. If there are none marked for that, then that requirement is not there, because then every single space is then open for that purposes. So I don't know if some of the city folks know if the individual stalls are marked. Is it a hybrid of that? I just don't.
It's kind of a hybrid. There's
Okay.
They're on the cross streets that go east-west.
Okay.
They're
Okay.
individually ones that have a ramp to be able to get off.
Okay, so where you have them marked, you have provided them, and I'm guessing if they did that with the downtown plan, they were probably trying to follow
That's what
that ratio.
So
Okay.
there are some marked.
Yeah.
There's one by the Hub Plaza, and then there's another one on another road too. So yeah.
But those are only in the side streets where you've got the diagonal parking. The parallel stalls are not marked.
I don't believe there's no marked
Okay.
there.
I will just add on to that, the specific area in terms of our involvement in the plan with regard to ADA is significant. And ADA is something that we will talk about right now as we go out on the walk, because this is where things get lost. I'll illustrate this through a point. Every day, almost every single morning, my day starts at a gym in Southeast Boise. There's a gentleman who's a trainer, and he's a wheelchair user. Where he's parked, where he's told and has to park, in terms of handicap parking, ADA parking, the detail's missed. The ramp is missing. So he gets out of his van, wheels himself into the drive aisle where potentially oncoming vehicles are moving, and has to go clear towards the corner where the intersection of the parking lot has another drive aisle, because that's where the ramp is for him to get up. That's the detail that's often missed, those little things, and that happens so often. And that's the area where we can't miss. We have to be batting 1,000, right? Otherwise, some things can happen. And it's an ADA, while clearly it is intended for those with some sort of a disability, the additional benefit is that, frankly, we all benefit from that, whether we have a disability or don't. Because a curb ramp is easy to negotiate. We just were talking with the mayor of Montpelier this morning, and he was telling he's a golf pro. It's his day job. His mom is telling him, I can't drive as much, and his response was, well, how about you just walk? And her response to him, her son, mayor, was, well, your town, I really can't do that because I'm afraid I'm going to trip, break a hip. And guess what? That's how my grandmother passed away. She fell off a curb, broke her hip, or her shoulder rather, and was never right from the next few years. So those details are really important for walkability, for ADA, for just accessing our goods, our services, our places of commerce, our residences, and so on. So it's definitely in our wheelhouse of what we talk about in the plan and our training.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Any other questions?
Mr. Mayor, on one of the slides you guys mentioned impending federal changes to ADA law. Can you expand on any of that?
Yeah. In all the infinite wisdom of our federal government, the ADA requirements for public rights of way have been in draft form for almost 25 years. So there's your efficiency, right? We are finally, in the Federal Register, have what is to be the final rule and the enforceable standards for that. And there are some changes that impact certain elements, and we do a lot of ADA transition plans and things, and we're actually working on a training course right now for some agencies to kind of compare that. So it's got one more step to go through with Department of Justice. I'm sure the Federal Highway Administration will drag their feet a little to kind of issue some of the other rules for it. The good part is Idaho Standards for Public Works Construction, which is a massive document that the state kind of follows, from things like guardrails and culverts to curb ramp design. Those were updated almost a decade and a half ago to reflect what was in the draft at the time, because we kept being told they're going to be final any day. So a lot of the newer stuff that's getting built is pretty close to it. There's been some subtle changes that I'd be happy to go in more detail if you want it, but hopefully we're finally at the point of not just calling it draft for a quarter century.
Sure.
So.
Thank you.
There's going to be some profound changes that are done in very subtle ways.
Yeah.
Details that nerds like us understand, but the public doesn't always get. And I'm going to give you an illustration. When we go out to a signal here, you push that button, right? It is programmed to give you a certain amount of time to get across that intersection. That math was not just pulled out of thin air. That math was crafted and determined by a computation. The width divided by a walk speed. That walk speed has been a federal guidance for quite a number of years. I dare you to go to Utah, because Utah has been using their own walk speed for years. So when ProAg's coming around and saying, hey, you remember that walk speed? You're going to have to change that. What does it mean? It means that if you're in the state of Utah, right now, you better walk about this fast to get across their intersections. What is the new requirement going to be? It's going to mean, well, now you're allowed to walk about this fast. Why? We're slowing down. We're getting older, right? We're getting to the point where we need a little bit more time. So think about what I just said, because on the surface you might think, well, is that big of a deal? If you're a car waiting to do that, what am I doing for you? I'm making you wait a little bit longer, aren't I? And when we drive in Utah, you better put that helmet on, right? Because it's go time, right? We all know it. Every time you go down the interstate, you could be going 85, the car going 95 next to you, Utah plates, right? We see it, we know it. That's the change. That's one example of the change that's coming. And you're going to see it not just in our state, but coast to coast. And it's going to rear its head in some ways that I think some folks weren't expecting. But the good news is, from our vantage point, it makes our community safer to walk, to be in a wheelchair, to have a walker, so that the mayor of Montpelier's mom can go get a gallon of milk and come back and not have to drive, because she ain't the best driver in the world. We don't want her doing that either, right? So hopefully those things that have been worked on and we've been waiting for 15 years or whatever actually result in a better situation.
So luckily, it's cooled down about 15 or 20 degrees if we were doing this over lunch, but so it might still be windy, I don't know. But that's inevitable out here, right? So let's just, if you need to take a nature break, go ahead and do that. Like I said, we're going to try to be done by 7. For those of you online, thank you very